Hi, I'm Zachary Benson Friedberg. I'm an artist that will be showing at Luz de Jesus Gallery this December. Behind me is a body of work that I've titled Yesterday's Tomorrow. So the inspiration for this show is really California Americana. Growing up in Southern California, sitting in the backseat of my parents' car, I was always drawn to neon signs or the unusual roof lines of a lot of the diners that still existed from the mid-century era. And I didn't know any of that at the time, but these were really interesting places that kind of stood out from the rest of the landscape. As I've gotten older, I've just had a really strong affection for roadside diners, particularly those all through Southern California. And as I've gotten older, I've seen more and more of them get demolished and destroyed. And I think we're losing a piece of this really unique and distinct American history by doing that. I completely understand the motivations and reasons for why architecture needs to get demolished sometimes, but I think there's also generally a lack of appreciation by those who are doing it. And this show is really intended to capture places that no longer exist and memorialize them in a meaningful way that speaks to sort of what made them special in the first place. And every piece in the show except for one is an actual building that existed in Southern California in the mid-century era, but has since been demolished. These pieces really were built at a time when there was this idea of the future and this sort of optimism. I've painted all of these pieces as the architecture generally looked, but I've put it through my lens with these really bright, vibrant colors, which I think represent the sort of upbeat, lively, sunny spirit of California, and also put them into a science fiction setting, either somewhere in space, perhaps an alternate dimension or reality where these buildings still do exist and people are able to go to them flying around in their space cars rather than just driving around PCH and pulling off into a diner. So every building in the show was designed, built, and has since been demolished. There's a few where maybe part of the structure still exists, but nothing that would be recognizable of the building as it actually existed during the mid-century era that it was built. I started with the concept of this show really just scouring the internet for architectural articles about preservation or battles to preserve buildings which have been lost. And fortunately, there's some fantastic books by Alan Hess, specifically about Googie architecture. One of them has all of the original concept arts from one of my favorite design firms, Armé and Davis. So I was able to look at just some of these original concept illustrations to base the art buildings off of. Why these resources were so invaluable is because to the extent these buildings had been demolished when the book was published, I was given the answer to my exhibit's whole motivation right there. So I was able to look for these buildings that I knew had no longer existed, that maybe I'd never even seen. Either they were demolished before I was born or I just never had a chance to see them in my life. So you'll note the buildings, I've tried to preserve largely what made them interesting and unique architecturally, but I've taken some liberties. One of the things that I like to do is put the rock walls in. Some of these buildings didn't have rock walls. I just think it's a really strong visual element that allows me to put some unique colors that really pop. Of course, none of these buildings were fluorescent pink. I just think that's a really upbeat and bold and happy color, which I always put into my paintings. I like to use these bright, vibrant, overly saturated colors. Obviously, some of the things that makes these buildings so notable is the brilliant neon signs or signage, which is, covers a part of the building, is part of the architecture and really eye-catching. So I preserved those signs which I was really drawn to. There's a number of signs which I didn't either care for the name or I couldn't find actually reference photos of the original building, so I may have taken liberties and changed those up. There's a couple of pieces in the show which you'll see the sign says Spacers. The original diner was named Carolina Pines Jr. It's very wordy. I wasn't terribly fond of the name or the sign. However, I used the lettering and the typeface to design the text for Spacers, and I just put that on as my own. And I thought it was very suited for a diner floating somewhere in space. So I've been painting Southern California architecture I think since 2019. And I've always had an extra element. I've always had sci-fi themes built into these pieces. So the last several shows I've done have focused on architecture. There's always been a strong narrative element and some sort of sci-fi aspects. I typically have maybe some figurative element, like people reacting to the scene, or explorers, as I call them, which are these interdimensional beings that open up portals and travel around to see different attractions. What makes this show different is that there's a distinct focus on architecture that doesn't exist anymore. So I may have painted buildings that still, you can drive into Palm Springs and see the home, you can drive into Los Angeles and you can see the diner Pans, for example. Those still exist. So I distinctly made a decision to paint buildings which are lost now as a way to preserve them. Something that made this architecture so interesting was there was a moment in, optimism about what the future was going to be. And besides being just populist architecture, it was supposed to appeal to everybody, just be eye-catching and pull you in. People were thinking, we're going to space, we are going to do really exciting and interesting things technologically. We will have hover cars, we will have robot butlers helping us out. And while we're moving in some of those directions, these buildings just represented a very different moment, and there was a promise of something which I think has somewhat been lost in a lot of the commercial design we see today. So while there's examples of really interesting architecture, of course, I don't mean to diminish that. Most commercial architecture you look around is just strip malls. It's really boring, just rectangular blocks, beige, taupe. It's dry and everything blends together. It's much more interesting, I think, and fun to see, bold shapes, eye-catching shapes, interesting signage. And it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, even just to take these blocky buildings and just paint them bright, fun colors would really shake up the landscape and make it a lot more interesting. When I was actually thinking about this show, I was really thinking of trying to capture this type of concept because I thought it really captures the essence of a lot of the work that I've been doing around architecture. And it means the nostalgia for a place or time that doesn't exist or never existed. And I came across it in the context of describing a Japanese artist, Hiroshi Nagai's work. And if you look at these pieces as, it's a real place, so people might have a nostalgic connection to these buildings or the Southern California, car culture. But obviously these buildings, they don't exist now, and they never existed the way I painted them. When you saw the building, maybe it was brown and orange, but it wasn't going to be hot pink with a bold fluorescent yellow and pink sign. And it certainly wasn't floating in space with some sort of cosmic backdrop and transspatial landscaping where you have palm trees coming out of portals from another dimension and hover cars. So clearly this is a scene that doesn't exist and has never existed. Well, at least has never existed as far as we know. Perhaps there's another dimension where this is reality.